In 2002, an internal auditor at a major corporation was reviewing routine expense reports. Thousands of them. Boring. Tedious. The kind of work that makes accountants fall asleep at their desks. And then she stopped, stared at her screen, and circled a $4 meal receipt that didn't make sense. Not because $4 was significant, but because the person who submitted it was supposed to be in New York that day. The receipt was from a restaurant in Chicago. That one $4 discrepancy, that one impossible receipt, unraveled a $200 million corporate fraud that had been hiding in plain sight for 7 years. The company was HealthSouth Corporation, one of America's largest healthcare service providers. The man at the center was Richard Scrushy, its founder, CEO, and the highest-paid executive in America in 1997. Charismatic, powerful, politically connected. He had built HealthSouth from nothing into a $4 billion empire. And he had been systematically falsifying its earnings since the very first day it went public. This is the story of how one auditor's instinct, triggered by a $4 receipt, brought down one of corporate America's most untouchable men. The crime. Richard Scrushy had a problem. Wall Street expected HealthSouth to hit its earnings targets every single quarter. Not occasionally. Every quarter. Without fail. And when the real numbers fell short, which they did consistently, Scrushy had a solution. He called it filling the gap. His CFO and a team of senior accountants would simply invent the difference. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. They called fake entries dirt. When earnings fell short by $50 million, they created $50 million in fictional revenue. When auditors questioned specific line items, they spread the fiction across hundreds of smaller entries too small to trigger individual scrutiny. Over 7 years they falsified $2.7 billion in earnings. Not millions. Billions. Across thousands of individual accounting entries. All designed to keep the stock price rising. All designed to keep Richard Scrushy's compensation, tied directly to stock performance, as high as possible. At its peak, Scrushy was earning $100 million per year. While the earnings that justified that compensation were entirely fictional. The fatal mistake. The $4 receipt belonged to William Owens, HealthSouth CFO. He had submitted an expense report claiming meals in New York on a day the receipt proved he was in Chicago. A junior auditor flagged it as a routine discrepancy. Asked Owens to clarify. Owens panicked. Not because of the $4, but because explaining why he was in Chicago that day meant explaining what he was doing there. Which meant explaining the meeting he had attended. Which meant explaining what that meeting was about. Rather than fabricate another lie, Owens made a decision that changed everything. He called a lawyer. And then he called the FBI. And then he agreed to wear a wire into his next meeting with Richard Scrushy. The investigation. What followed was one of the most dramatic corporate fraud investigations in American history. Owens recorded conversations with Scrushy that prosecutors described as devastating. Explicit discussions of the fraud. Instructions on how to hide it. Casual references to billions in falsified earnings as though they were routine business decisions. The forensic accounting team that dismantled HealthSouth's books spent 18 months reconstructing 7 years of falsified records. They identified 4,764 individual fraudulent entries. They interviewed 27 co-conspirators, every single one of whom eventually cooperated with prosecutors. And they built a case so comprehensive that Richard Scrushy faced 85 separate criminal counts. The verdict. And then, in one of the most shocking verdicts in white-collar crime history, Richard Scrushy was acquitted on all 85 counts in 2005. The jury didn't believe the cooperating witnesses. The wire recordings weren't enough. The man who had overseen $2.7 billion in accounting fraud walked free. But the story doesn't end there. In 2006, Scrushy was convicted in a separate case, bribery of an Alabama governor. He was sentenced to nearly 7 years in federal prison. HealthSouth, rebranded as Encompass Health, paid $100 million to settle SEC charges. The shareholders who lost billions never recovered their money. And the 27 accountants who falsified the books received sentences ranging from probation to 5 years in prison. All of it traced back to a $4 meal receipt. From the wrong city. Richard Scrushy built a $4 billion empire on fictional numbers. And it took one auditor, doing the most boring job in finance, to notice the one detail that didn't fit. The lesson forensic accountants took from HealthSouth was simple: fraud doesn't fail because investigators are brilliant. It fails because fraudsters always make one small mistake. Tomorrow on the Fraud Files, the CEO who paid himself in secrets until the IRS found his hidden account. Subscribe. Because we follow every dollar. Every time.